See, Nigar, of course, where you are right now, Donald Trump is having a military parade. He has just arrived at that, I understand. But we were speaking to our correspondent earlier about the fact that he may be somewhat distracted by what is going on in the Middle East and the US position there. Of course, earlier, Donald Trump had endorsed this attack, but he has very much made it clear from when he took office that he wants to keep the US out of any sort of war in the Middle East. So do you see that position shifting, and in what direction may that shift?
Well, the American people polls have shown time and again, as recent as last month, that the American people have no appetite for another big war in the Middle East. You know, U.S. going to open war with Iran. The memories of Iraq and Afghanistan, those are seen as failures. A lot of American blood and resources wasted that potentially brought just more instability and conflict to the region. And so there is no appetite for that in the U.S. But however, there's a lot of pressure from U.S.'s closest ally in the region, which is Israel, and also interest groups here in Washington for the U.S. to get involved. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, this is no secret, he's been pushing for a war with Iran for 20 years, for the U.S. to actually start the war with Iran, to attack Iranian sites. Well, the U.S. didn't do that. Under previous administrations, President Biden didn't get involved in that, and President Trump also refused to start that war now. But the Israelis have started it, and now I think the attempt is to pull the U.S. into this war. And then looking at the big picture, I think the main goal here is not so much of a military or nuclear target. The main target here was diplomacy, was nuclear diplomacy between Iran and the U.S., the talks that were going on. You know, these attacks by the Israelis happened just 2 days before the talks were scheduled between Iran and the U.S. in Oman. And the Israeli Prime Minister has been trying publicly and privately to sabotage those talks. He did under President Obama, he tried, and he's been trying under President Trump, and the talks are now off. So in the short term, that goal has also been achieved.
And Donald Trump has made it clear that he wants to be something of a peacemaker during his time in office, wanting to sort of bring peace through making deals, which he's finding perhaps is a lot more difficult than he might have thought. So where do you think things will go next in terms of what Donald Trump may decide to do in regards to this escalation that we're seeing between Iran and Israel?
Correct. So again, President Trump, like the previous presidents, everyone after George Bush, has been running on a campaign of ending the endless wars in the Middle East and not starting any new ones just because these wars are so unpopular in the U.S. But as far as that actually happening in reality, we see that big war just in front of us. Not only the war in Gaza hasn't ended, Russia's attack on Ukraine, that war has not ended. And this is just a new war that could potentially escalate into the next big endless war in the Middle East. So as far as the administration making good on their promise, it's only been a few months. They haven't ended any war, and they're overseeing the start of a new one. Now, if the U.S. still has a lot of influence on Israel, and so far, it looks like the Israeli Prime Minister has outmaneuvered President Trump. President Trump either couldn't or didn't want to stop this Israeli attack. But he still has the chance, while the U.S. hasn't been directly involved and is not in open war with Iran, has not yet engaged. I think the U.S. can push the Israelis to take an off-ramp, de-escalate, and then return to the negotiating table with the Iranians and try to resolve, if it's a nuclear issue, through the negotiations, the nuclear negotiations, which the Iranians also showed interest in. So again, the U.S. is the big change maker here. They can be the adults in the room, and the president and his administration can make good on their promise, or they can just watch potentially the next big war in the Middle East, or essentially the conflict that has been spreading in the past 2 years just expand in the region.
And as we see this escalation continue, it's difficult to see a return to diplomacy. But do you think that may be possible, and what might that take? Because obviously the Iranians have said, we don't want, we have no interest now in being involved in these talks given what's gone on. We don't believe that the US doesn't have any involvement to the extent that they have said. So what might it take to return to the negotiating table, to return to diplomacy?
Well, from the Iranian perspective, they can't sit at a table and negotiate about the same nuclear program while that nuclear program is being bombed by Israel, an ally of the U.S. Although Israel is not a party to these negotiations. So what the U.S. can do if a ceasefire happens, and that can only be forced if the U.S. puts pressure on Israel, they can potentially achieve a ceasefire, so Israel and Iran essentially de-escalate. Like we saw similar episodes back in October and in April. There was a tit for tat and then they stopped. This time it has continued, but the U.S. can put an end to it. And once these attacks on Iran's nuclear program have stopped, potentially Iran may be then considering returning to the nuclear negotiating table. But that trust has been really diminished, especially in the Trump administration, because in the first term, also, let's not forget, President Trump was the one who pulled out of the previous nuclear deal made between Iran and the U.S., the JCPOA, while Iran was abiding by that deal. He just didn't like it because his previous president, a Democrat, made that deal, so he pulled out of that deal. And that already diminished trust between Iran and the U.S. with this exact president. And this is just adding to that.
Nigar Mortazavi, political analyst, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you.